A couple of minutes past now, so I'll kick off. Welcome everybody to the latest in this FarrPoint webinar series. I'm Richard Parkinson. I'm one of the directors at FarrPoint, and I'm going to be hosting the panel today. Today we're going to be discussing the resilience of the UK's communications networks. We're all increasingly reliant on digital services in just about every aspect of our life. So we're all directly impacted if the wired and wireless networks that deliver those services fail. How reliable are these networks? What are the risks if they fail? And what, if anything, can be done to improve resilience? We'll be talking about all these questions with our panel today. Just before I introduce the panel, a few housekeeping points. We are recording the session, so please do keep your camera and microphone switched off throughout the session. We will be sending a link out to the recording to everyone that attended afterwards. We hope to be able to leave some time for questions at the end of the session, so please put any questions you've got in the chat as we go through the discussion. And finally, when I hide my slides in a second and the discussion starts, you'll find that Zoom's gallery view is the best way to watch the webinar and see the panel. With that, I will introduce our panel. We've got a great panel today who can provide a view on this topic from a range of perspectives. From a regulator's perspective, we've got William Wedge from Ofcom. From a network provider's perspective, we've got Kirsty Baxter-Smith from BT Group. For government, we've got Mark Forsyth from Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. And finally, representing things from a network user's perspective, we've got Martin Fitchie from Motion Technology Services Limited. So with that, I will hide my slides. And I will kick us off by asking each of our panel to introduce themselves, give a bit more information on their role, and give us some initial thoughts on what you think the current levels of resilience are in the UK's communication networks. Are they good? Are they bad? And just some initial thoughts. I'll start with William, if I could, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. So my name is William Wedge. I'm a Principal Technology Advisor in Ofcom, and I'm the technical lead on our network and service resilience work here at Ofcom. So before joining Ofcom back in 2021, I spent over 20 years of my career architecting communications networks and services, working for BT, EE, Orange, and Lucent Technologies before that. And over that time, I was heavily involved in designing fixed and mobile communications networks, as well as voice, internet, and critical services. So in terms of the current levels of resilience in UK networks, I guess the first slightly cheeky point is to say, well, resilience to what? There are many, many different kinds of risks to network resilience. Some of those risks are easier and cheaper to mitigate than others. Some risks have a high potential impact. They can be quite catastrophic, but they happen very infrequently, let's say 1 in 20 years, for example. So I think there's a constant challenge in balancing the demands of higher speeds and newer services, and which inevitably means new technologies, decommissioning legacy technologies, and then maintaining resilience or redundancy in networks. And of course, the overall cost is really challenging. So all in all, I think modern networks in the UK are reasonably resilient for most risks. However, there is room for improvement in a number of areas. Some of those areas include immaturity of the new technologies, robustness of testing, change management, operational processes. But a lot of these themes are not fundamentally new. So I think I'll finish there and hand over to the next speaker.
Great. Kirsty, from a network provider's perspective.
Thanks, Richard. Morning, everyone. I'm Kirsty Baxter-Smith, and I'm the Director of Operational Resilience and Service Management for BT. I've been in the role for about 6 months. Before that, I've working in mobile side of BT, so EE. I've been in telco for about 20 years, mostly from the mobile background. So obviously my role is is really about looking after the governance of our mobile and our fixed networks, making sure that we've got the right disaster recovery plans in place and business continuity. So I'm very interested in networks resilience, as you can imagine. From a BT point of view, I think we're in a good place. We have well-established contingency plans to ensure that we keep our networks connected in a variety of scenarios. And that will help maintain the core of our fixed broadband and landline network, and also our mobile networks in the event of power outages, including backup generators, battery backups, and so on. As you know, a mobile network is split into core and radio access networks, and we have extensive resilience in our core network. So we have 7-day backup in the event of power going down. And we're working with the power industry to help prioritize digital phone network resilience in the event of any future storms and subsequent power outages. And in addition, a lot of masts provide overlapping coverage. And we're also working to ensure that more of our sites have backup generators as well. As you probably know, emergency calls can be made on any phone network. So if a customer lives in an area where their network doesn't have reception, but another does, then they will get emergency calls only. And we estimate that less than 1% of our landline customers' premises have insufficient mobile signal to make an emergency call. And this number will drop as we invest in building the mobile shared rural network. So under this program, we've already built or upgraded over 1,600 sites, completing the first program 6 months ago, and we're ramping that up at the moment. In the event of power outage, obviously that's really key. Our legacy landline services will be largely unaffected, and they'll still be able to make voice calls, including accessing the emergency services, assuming the local exchange has backup generator capacity. So having said all of that, of course, we're always working to improve resilience. We're confident that our current levels of resilience would minimize disruption across the core of our network, but it's impossible to be 100% resilient. And increasingly, climate change and an uneasy geopolitical landscape, network resilience will always be a really important priority for us.
Great.
I'll hand over. Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Kirsty. Mark?
Morning, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be here, sort of sharing perspectives with you and the other panel members today. So thank you for inviting me, and certainly sort of recognise everything I think William and Kirsty were saying. So, in terms of myself, I'm Mark Forsyth. I'm head of telecoms resilience in the Department for Science and Innovation and Technology. That means with a bit of government that sort of thinks about and cares about network resilience. So we work with other partners across government and with the sector itself to prepare for a wide range of emergencies and support the sector in responding to those emergencies, but also ensuring the right policy framework to enable all of that to happen in the right balance is also there and in place. My particular background is largely in counterterrorism and security policy operations and strategy in a variety of different government departments. So well used to sort of setting those frameworks and advising ministers and working with external parties. So in terms of if network resilience is good or bad, it's obviously a big old question, but I suppose you could think about it in two ways. Is it a good thing? Clearly, we would say yes, it is a good thing. What we want is digital infrastructure that is secure, resilient, drives growth, and is affordable for the public. So all of those things are sort of complementary and in confluence. And clearly, having a resilient network is good for users, good for social benefits, and for the economy as well. So the approach that we take is really just about managing the risks to the resilience that others have already talked a little bit about in the right way, in an appropriate and proportionate way. And clearly, there is a sort of commercial driver towards resilience because it's good for end users, and it's attractive for customers, but it can be difficult and costly. So making sure those things are sort of in the right balance are key. We're conscious that we're asking a lot of the sector at the current time, quite rightly, in relation to other priorities in terms of rollout of 5G and full fibre, cybersecurity requirements, removal of high-risk vendor equipment from networks and so on. So we're very conscious of all of that mix and getting the right balance for resilience. In terms of, if you think about the question in terms of is it good enough, which is perhaps what the true question was, I think it's pretty good. I think we've got a healthy sort of system of engaged operators, engaged government, independent regulator, and so on and so forth that we can probably talk a little bit later on. But we do see incidents more, and the more that we can do to drive those downwards can only be a good thing. Most outages are minor and are sort of systems failures, but there are challenges around question about sort of power dependency, legacy technologies, extreme weather, climate change, and more besides. So I'm sure we can cover more of those a little bit later on, Richard.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And Martin.
Good morning, Richard, and also thanks for inviting me along with the panel here. So yeah, my name's Martin Fitch. I'm the Director of Motion Technology Services Limited, and we provide consulting services for host cities who are hosting major events, usually sport events. So talking multi-discipline, multi-venue events. I've been working in the industry for a long time, worked on Commonwealth Games, Olympics, various world championships, football, rugby, you name it. I've probably been to the event. But most recently, we provide specialist advice to the cities and on all their technology matters, but connectivity and the related resilience is certainly one of the primary pieces of the puzzle, and it's one that comes up straight away, and it's one of the biggest budget ones, and it's absolutely critical to the running of any major event. So that the types of connectivity we're looking at is what I'd say venue connectivity. So that's usually a fiber coming into the venue, and it provides all the connectivity that they need on the venue. It transports firstly, we'd have a broadcast network, which has to be super resilient, and the broadcasters are very specific about their requirements, not only in actual resilience, but actually the quality of the signal that's sent over that network, because previously images would be sent by satellite, but now they tend to go across the network, and that has to be a dedicated network. And with experiences in Scotland, where we've hosted quite a lot of major events, it tends to be a combination of a dark fiber network and wavelength solutions. And usually BT come into the frame, OpenReach come into the frame, or BT at some point, because there's often venues that aren't supported by whichever the supplier is. There are a lot of, within Glasgow itself, there are a lot of local providers who have their own infrastructure. So that's with TV. We also have to then provide all the internet for the clients within the sport event, the federations, and the officials, the athletes, the medical, the anti-doping. They all need internet connections for the competition to be able to run. And the timing and scoring provider, everyone expects to have these live results. They have to be sent over the internet. So that has to be resilient. And then communications as well, of course, within the venues. So landlines, and then mobile networks as well. So we rely on mobile phones. Everyone is using a mobile phone, and that's probably the biggest challenge area that we have, because the network that we design within the venue is within our control, but the mobile network operator signals is not. If we look at venues like Tollcross, it's a challenge. The signal's really poor in there. So we have to, each event we've got to assess the quality. And then radios is the other piece of it as well. especially challenging on if you've got like a road cycling event. But radios, then we're starting to look at safety, and one thing is servicing all the clients that you can run a sport event, but the other side is the safety crowd, looking after all the client groups and the spectators. And we've seen this, as well as actually being able to have the communication, it's knowing how to use it as well. So we have various risks that everyone's aware of just now, like protesters that just stop oil and so on. We saw that at the cycling event. We need to have good communication resilience for that. And then we've seen more serious things like at the Manchester arena bombing, and the communications is high up in the lessons learned from there. Okay.
Well, that's helpful, Martin, and I can come back to some of these risks maybe on the next question. So, I mean, thank you for your answers there. I mean, summarizing that, I mean, I heard from most people that resilience is pretty good, but there does seem to be a lot of complexity there. Network reliability dependent on where I live, whether I've got overlapping mobile coverage, whether that mobile mast has got power in it, et cetera, who my provider is, what technology they're using to deliver my services. There's a lot of factors in there that are going to affect whether I have a reliable network or not. I mean, if I'm a customer, how do I know how and if my network services could be impacted? And similarly, if I'm a local authority delivering services across the region, how am I going to know which of my service users are going to be affected and when? So I guess that leads us on to just a bit more about risk. I mean, what are the risk areas if networks do fail, and if I'm a customer or a public service provider, how do I know whether I'm at risk or who's at risk? Mark, can I start with you on that one, please?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Richard. I think it's an important question. So, and again, you could look at it in two slightly different ways. So you could think about the risks to networks failing, and then the risks of networks failing. So they're both important to think about. So in terms of the risk to networks failing, like we've been saying earlier on, most disruption is due to hardware or systems failures issues. Part of, and William might want to say more about that when he speaks possibly, but part of what we think about in government is a sort of higher impact risk, maybe lower likelihood but higher impact risks. So we're responsible for 3 risks in the National Risk Register related to disruption to subsea cables, simultaneous loss of fixed and mobile communications, sort of a storm Arwen sort of type event effectively, and a major cyber attack that affects the sector. So we do a lot of work to sort of think about and prepare for those sort of more extreme scenarios as sort of central government's role in doing that. But we also think about other topics, sort of severe weather, climate change, and ensuring that the sector is well adapted to prepare for the future, disruption potentially to 999 that can occur, and ensuring the public has uninterrupted access, severe space weather events, potentially, which are infrequent. We only see them sort of potentially every few decades, but we had one over the weekend, so we'll be thinking about what we can learn from that. And as we had expected and analysed, it had a low impact as far as we can see on telecoms networks, which is fantastic. But we'll still be using the opportunity to sort of understand what we can learn from that. And we also think about sort of major national events, so sort of in perhaps more in sort of Martin's area to some degree, but ensuring that the sector is able to prepare for major national events. So the G7 conference that took place in Cornwall, I think in 2021, the conference of parties, the big climate change summit in Glasgow, 2022, I think, the Queen's funeral, for example, the King's coronation, those sort of big national events where you need to ensure that there's adequate network availability and installation of temporary equipment and so on in different locations is sort of part of what we can help sort of make sure what happens. In terms of the question around risks from services failing, well, clearly there's a social impact. You know, everyone, as we all know, everyone sort of relies upon increasingly upon networks being available to sort of, you know, for everyday life. So, you know, having modeled the impact, you know, most of the impact would be an economic impact. So both our own modeling, but also sort of open source research sort of shows that the cost of a loss of telecoms nationwide for an hour, so if you looked at, let's say, a sort of very severe cyber attack that disrupted networks for that period of time, you know, would be around, open source research sort of points to around £90 million per hour, and obviously that's highly driven by business demand and impact on kind of sectors that are very dependent on ICT. But as I was saying earlier on, sort of get a clear social impact as well. People need to be able to contact the emergency services without interruption. There are also interdependencies with other sectors. You know, other critical sectors across the economy need to have telecoms available to do their business, whether that's government, finance, the power sector, the broadcast sector. You know, sort of and. So we do a lot of work to understand. We're quite demanding of our sector by asking them for lots of information about their critical assets and where they are and what they depend upon. And then work with others in government to map where those interdependencies are and sort of understand if there's more that can be done to sort of shore up any vulnerabilities around that. Clearly, the government has, in the last year or so, introduced a new emergency alerts capability using the mobile network to be able to sort of send emergency text to members of the public in specific local areas in response to, you know, wildfires or other sorts of localized risks like that. So that's not something that my department is responsible for, but clearly it uses the mobile infrastructure, which is essential. So it needs to be working and available for those emergency alerts to be issued. So those are the sorts of flavour of issues, I think, in terms of the impacts of services being disrupted.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Kirsty, come to yourself from a network provider's point of view. How much work is done from understanding the risks of network outages from your perspective?
Yes, there's a huge amount of work done, and I won't repeat all of the stuff that Mark's just been talking about, but we're heavily involved in that sort of work. We also regularly run exercises with the utilities companies, the power companies, and so on, to war game, if you like, certain scenarios. And just a couple of words about the BAU work that we do. So some of the things that we have set up behind the scenes to deal with these risks and when we do have network issues. So we have our emergency response team. So they're based across the UK, and they're able to deploy sort of specialist equipment, rapid response vehicles, contain mobile base station capabilities, satellite modem, VSAT backhaul, and so on. So they can be rapidly deployed if we have issues. Probably most recently, they were helping out when we had our recent floods in the recent storms. So we had risk of flooding at a couple of our exchange centres. So they were deployed there and helped protect the telephone exchanges then. And also we do a lot of work with satellite resilience as well. So as you can imagine, satellite connectivity plays a really important part with everyday network resilience. So our site at Madeley is a really important cog in delivering the resilience. So we have 60 satellite dishes on site, ranging from 32 meters to just 75 centimeters. So they will help provide that resilience there. And the ability of satellites to deliver this high-speed coverage is really key. So we use satellite backhaul in our own connectivity portfolio to support the delivery of our own fixed and mobile network to our customers. So those are just a couple of examples of what we're doing to make sure that we're mitigating the risk that Mark has described.
Great. Thank you, Kirsty. And Martin, come to you next. I mean, from your experience of working on these sporting events, I mean, are there lessons learned there in terms of the sorts of risks that may apply more broadly to businesses and to public services?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there are quite a lot of the risks are within our control, but we rely on educating the host cities and giving them, I mean, the best way is often anecdotes to explain to them why they should take on board our advice. Because if the advice is not taken, then things go wrong, and it has can have a high visibility impact for the host city. There's a couple of examples I can think of. There was a UCI World Cup event recently. I wouldn't say the location, but it's in the manual that they have to have resilient internet. So they gave them 2 internet lines, but it wasn't really resilient because it came off the same switch, which failed, and the live results stopped working in the middle of the event. And the UCI were on the brink of suing the host city because of that. We've, if the network goes down for the TV, that's a major disaster, because then the whole transmission's gone, and that has a great financial impact and visible impact, reputational impact. So, like I said, a lot of that we can control ourselves if we have the design of the network. But then we reach these points where we're relying on external pieces of the puzzle. For example, with some of it might go through OpenReach gear that we don't have control of the service levels and so on. And then, yeah, there's the safety aspect, which was discussed before. Having resilience on the mobile network is important and very much out of our control. We do speak to them. We try to speak to the mobile network operators in advance. Many of them are supportive in that they can provide temporary infrastructures to enhance the signals during the events, but it's not always available. It's not always, they don't always have the budget to do that. And the host cities often, especially just now, don't have the budget to pay for the enhanced services. So it's getting the balance right.
Thank you, Martin. And William.
So I think a lot of the key points that I would mention have already been raised by Mark and Kirsty. But I guess I'll just focus on a few that often in this area we tend to focus on access to the emergency services, but I think there are a plethora of other impacts as well, beyond the kind of general societal impact that Mark mentioned. So some of those might just be contacting your family members to check on them, during particular emergencies. Getting information about when the network or service will be restored, but other contexts like the local authorities' ability to contact vulnerable customers. So it's not always about people contacting the emergency services or somebody else. It's also about other public sector bodies contacting specific people that they need to check on. There's potential for vulnerable people in rural communities to become isolated. So this is a topic that we get a lot of MPs letters on, or letters from the public. I think in a post PSTN era, the move to digital telephony ends up with things like GP surgeries using IP-based telephony services, and we need to make sure that those are resilient and reliable as well. So there's this notion of whether something is kind of an engineered, solution that is highly resilient and reliable, or if it's something that's just built on the internet. The resilience of those two different options are wildly different. So that's something that needs to be thought about as well. I think potentially we get into scenarios where we lose both fixed and mobile, but things like data sharing about particular scenarios of vulnerable customers is still a big challenge. We also can't make assumptions that everyone will have both a fixed and a mobile phone, because there's still a percentage of the population that doesn't. Again, as Mark said, this is a cross-sector dependency or interdependency use case. So the power networks themselves have become increasingly dependent on communications networks, both to operate their own network as well as their field force. So I think all in all, there's a lot of interdependent parts to the whole ecosystem. And I think working out which are the appropriate levels of resilience in which areas are a key challenge.
Okay.
I think everything else has been covered.
Thank you. So, I mean, there's a range of risks clearly that have been outlined there, and what I'm hearing is a range of approaches to addressing those risks. Some are technical, some are maybe down to regulation, legislation, and some are around maybe better communication and awareness. I mean, just looking at what can be done to address the risks. Do we have views on whether it is predominantly a technical issue? Are we looking at retaining microwave networks rather than be completely reliant on fiber, installing power backup? Again, is it down to legislation, or is there that element of non-technical awareness raising, and that we as customers all need to accept that network outages are inevitable and plan for them accordingly? Organizations need to have business continuity plans that talk about this. I mean, how do we go about addressing some of these risks? Kirsty, I'll come back to you first, if that's okay on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I think it's down to everybody. Collaboration across the government, suppliers, and different industries is key, as well as the customers, of course, themselves. So we work closely with industry, stakeholders, including DCIT and Ofcom, to develop the most robust contingency plans that we can. For example, we're working with the energy sector and the regional electricity companies to improve communication and collaboration across power and telecoms, to reduce the likelihood of incidents on network. And we're pushing for greater resilience in the power network to mitigate the risks to phone and broadband. So in particular, it's really important that we work on regulations so that they can be changed, so that the power network operators are able to prioritize critical infrastructure, such as the telecom sector, during planned and unplanned power outages. We think that's really important. And then we as an industry should be investing in self-powering technologies. So we're doing a lot of work around becoming less dependent on grid technology. Much of this is tied to our environmental responsibilities. And you've probably heard of our ambition to be net zero by March 2031. But enhancing resilience is an equally important benefit of some of those programs as well. So we're looking at the possibility of self-powering sites, looking at how we may be able to power some of our mobile sites through a combination of wind and solar panels, which would create further resilience, especially where we are lacking overlapping mobile coverage. And we're trialing at the moment use of solar panels at our BT exchange in Erdington near Birmingham. And if that's successful, then that will really support the resilience of buildings such as those for our core network.
Great, thank you, Kirsty. Mark, I'll come to you next, if I can, just asking about how we address these risks, but just picking up on one of the points that Kirsty mentioned there about critical national infrastructure. I mean, that has seen as the power networks and blue light organizations, etc. I mean, is there work being undertaken to look at the definition of critical national infrastructure? Just thinking about some of the work that I'm involved in digital services in health and care. We're increasingly seeing people being treated in their own home, virtual wards, social care being delivered using digital services in the home, etc. I mean, is the definition of critical national infrastructure being looked at in light of some of these changes about how we're using and delivering digital services at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Shall I have a go at that one?
Sorry, two questions there.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. They're both very valid. So there is a definition for critical national infrastructure. I forget whether it's sort of a classified definition or if it's in the public domain. I imagine it probably is in the public domain, and it's fine to sort of to mention it, and I can sort of take it away if that would be helpful. But it is defined. It is understood within government. Telecoms and the internet is considered part of critical national infrastructure, and we approach it in that way. And there are 13 sectors in total, sort of covering everything from finance to defence and chemicals and everything in between, including telecoms and the internet, of course. And a little bit like I was saying earlier on, we sort of recognise that telecoms is one of those sort of top tier sectors, if you like, that everyone depends on and enables a lot of the other sectors to function effectively in all the sort of obvious ways. So part of the reason why we do that mapping work that I mentioned earlier on, which is through a program called Criticalities, is to understand where those interdependencies are between specific assets and specific sites in the UK that are either considered critical national infrastructure for telecoms in and of themselves, or are sites in other sectors that have a dependency on that asset, or vice versa. That's obviously quite painstaking and challenging work, partly because the nature of networks and assets and sites and so on is constantly evolving. But we think it's important to do. So we're continually kind of looking at that and seeing where we can understand how to strengthen those any vulnerabilities that may exist sort of between them to maximise the UK sort of collective resilience. That probably brings me on quite nicely, I suppose, to the second question, which was around what needs to be done and who does what, I suppose. So I sort of completely support what William and Kirsty were saying around that. It's about roles, right? There's definitely a role for everybody, and it's we certainly favour taking a collaborative approach. And I think because of the complexity of the networks, the complexity of the risks, the complexity of the sort of wider operating environment, a variety of sort of tools and solutions, are kind of necessary to kind of, consider and deploy, whether that's technical, policy, legal, and so on and so forth. So there isn't a sort of one single solution that will solve all problems, but it's about carefully analysing what those risks are and kind of designing an appropriate and proportionate solution to those. So the National Resilience Framework that was published, I think December 2022, and sort of provides a sort of a national framework, as the name suggests, for how the UK approaches resilience as a whole, has a number of sort of foundational principles. It's relevant to mention a couple of those, I think. One is an emphasis on prevention and preparation over cure and response wherever possible. And secondly is about taking a whole of society approach to problems and empowering and enabling everybody to sort of do their role. So I think for the context that we're talking about, clearly there's a role for communications providers who own and operate those networks to ensure that they meet their obligations, to ensure that they're appropriately secure and resilient. There's a role for an independent regulator to inspect, enforce all of that, and sort of very much welcome Ofcom's role in that. There's a role for government in establishing the laws that we need, and I think we do have the laws that we need in a variety of places, whether it's the Communications Act, the Telecom Security Act, the Network and Information Systems regulations, the Civil Contingencies Act, is a variety of different places. It's probably important to sort of take note of the consultation that Ofcom have recently concluded around network resilience guidelines, giving guidelines to communication providers on how they might best meet their statutory obligations. So that's something we certainly sort of have welcomed and supported. So we'll be sort of keen to work with, continue to work with Ofcom as that's sort of considered in terms of any next steps. And sort of going back to the collaboration point, really, we certainly think the best way is to work in partnership with all sort of parties in the sector. So we support and host the Electronic Communications Resilience Response Group, which brings together private and public sector to sort of promote resilience across the sector and to collaborate and coordinate kind of responses to any particular emergency. So we have those sort of sets of levers to be able to bring everyone together in emergency mode and continue to kind of see the emergency through until closure and lessons learned. But also lots of other kind of examples. So definitely recognise what Kirsty was describing around the sort of collaboration between the power sector and the telecom sector as much as possible. These things are difficult, so wherever we can identify, you know, deliverable or low cost or no cost solutions to some of these challenges, we're definitely sort of very much open to those. And sort of Kirsty has mentioned one or two of those already. You know, if there are sort of people in the audience that have wondered, oh, has anyone thought about X or has Y been tried? We're definitely kind of very much in the market. We're always thinking about kind of new ways to solve these tricky problems. So, you know, very much welcome to people to make suggestions, and we'll take anything away if we haven't already kind of explored it. Even just for example, like tomorrow we are hosting a workshop on the topic of physical security to telecoms networks. So we've sort of seen anecdotal reports of people describing a possible uptick in issues like vandalism and metal theft. So, you know, we're simply sort of convening and gathering telecoms operators, the police, the National Protective Security Authority, and sort of a number of others to share their experiences effectively and share kind of good practice and tips for sort of countermeasures. So there's an awful lot that can be done simply by kind of working effectively together with others. So we sort of really support that. And as I think you intimated, and others, as I said, there's clearly a role for sort of end users themselves. So, you know, of course, you know, all businesses should have business continuity plans and think about kind of disruption, including to telecoms. And clearly, there's things that individual households can do to protect, to sort of protect themselves as best possible. The government is going to launch a new website in the very near future. I think I can probably say, providing a single source of advice for members of the public on how they can prepare their households to a variety of emergencies, whether it's flooding or power cuts or terrorist attacks or telecoms disruption and so on and so forth, which we've been feeding into, because there's simple measures that households can take to prepare themselves both in advance of something happening, but also when something is happening, in terms of, you know, having a battery operated radio or making sure you got enough medication to last you for a period of time, and, you know, bottles of water and all these sorts of very practical measures that they're all important. They're all sort of help our collective resilience.
Great, thank you, Mark. William, to yourself, what can be done to manage these risks?
Sure. So again, I think it's tricky to find things that haven't already been said, but I'll have a good go. So I think in addition to the points that were already mentioned, I think the educational aspect, really trying to ensure that there's a better understanding and appreciation for the techno-economic challenge of resilience. It costs money. It requires investment. So I think there needs to be an alignment of expectations. So, you know, which are the key risks to be addressed, to what extent, which services to prioritize the protection of. And again, as I say, a better appreciation for what that means in terms of cost. One thing that we did, in addition to the consultation on revised resilience guidance for communications providers, alongside that, we launched a call for input, which was about power backup for mobile radio access networks. And one of the key objectives of that was to draw out all of the points about expectations, services that, you know, people really do depend on, and try and highlight there's a cost aspect to that as well. So we were trying to bring that out in a public kind of way and be transparent with everybody about it, so that we get some alignment of expectations. So following on from that, or alongside that, the consultation that we completed back on the 1st of March on revised technical guidance for networks and services for communication providers. It is technical guidance. It also covers operational processes that we would expect within communication providers networks, things like change management, proper testing, and a variety of other measures that we feel are needed. It's important to note that the way that Ofcom's powers work is we can only sort of expect what is proportionate. So effectively, there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and in order for us to, let's say, expect or require particular level of investment or particular measures to be put in, there needs to be a holistic benefit to society. So when rolling out new networks, the cost of rolling them out with enhanced resilience is lower than trying to retrofit it later. That's a pretty obvious point. So we're always trying to look at, well, what is the next thing coming along? What are the new technologies? And ensuring that when they are rolled out, they're done properly in the first place. So that some of that are key points that we're doing. We plan on publishing an updated version of that guidance this summer. So quite shortly. We're very, very active on that, very busy. And once that is done, we will monitor the effectiveness of that over time. We will both proactively and reactively, look at what's happening in networks. And if we feel that providers are not meeting their legal obligations, set out in the Communications Act, then we will investigate and potentially enforce against that. So I think that's what we think can be done kind of from our side of things and within communications providers. I think in terms of the responsibilities, as Kirsty mentioned, I think it's everybody's responsibility or a joint responsibility. There are a number of things that consumers and business owners could and should do, and that is look at the resilience and reliability of the services that you procure, the CPs that you procure from, and be willing to pay a bit more to get a more reliable service. Ultimately, that is what is going to drive resilience in the sector. In terms of consumers, well, there are a number of things that they can do. Mark mentioned, a publication that's going to come out, but I think they can also think about, at least from a technical perspective, and I don't want to get too technical, but look at the spectrum bands that are being rolled out for 4G and 5G, things like 700 and 800 megahertz spectrum. Those are going to provide the broadest coverage. So having devices that are 4G and 5G that support that is going to be important. Looking at simple things like having, power banks that you can recharge your phones. And if you're a landline dependent customer or vulnerable customer, contact your provider, understand whether or not your digital landline or your landline in general is going to work in a power cut. And if you are a landline dependent customer, the communication provider will be required to provide you with a battery backup solution within your home. But other basic things like making sure that you don't use a cordless phone, that you can buy from some retail outlet. Of course, I think we all on this call will realize that if they lose power, they don't work, but still not that many people still have a corded phone that they can plug in a power cut. So these are all some basic things. So I think I'll probably finish off there.
That's
Thanks.
great. Thank you very much. And Martin, I'll come to you just to answer the same question, but I guess put a spin on it as well, just given some of your experience, working with sporting events kind of internationally. I mean, the UK is not the only country undertaking these kind of changes. I mean, are there lessons that can be learned from other parts of the world that could be applied in the UK?
I think we're seeing a lot of the same across events across the globe, because I see the same consultants being called out to go all around the place to advise cities wherever they are. I think there are lessons to be learned, and it's what's the platform to share those. I have a colleague who's been doing a lot of work over in the States, and he says they have a really good system for communication that cab drivers use, I think, that can be rolled out, that could be rolled out potentially in the UK. I don't know the details of it, but just reflecting on the previous answers to the question, I totally agree. It's what William was saying about education, and from our perspective, like I said before, it's about educating the host cities, and I think we need to be able to engage the host cities early on before they've committed to these events to help them understand what's going to be involved in terms of what they need for safety and resilience, and also so that it's not a kind of budget surprise later on in the project. And then the collaboration as well. So having the right people to talk to early on, people that understand the major events. We do a lot of work with Ofcom. We see now a significant number of Spectrum users coming into events. And I'm not just talking hundreds, it could be thousands of people bringing in their own equipment, TV broadcasting equipment, wireless microphones, Starlink, teams bringing in their own radios. So we've got a good relationship with Ofcom, and they help us to manage the Spectrum licensing for the event. That keeps the events protected for the critical event services and for safety. And we try to have Ofcom to come in during the events and monitor. So, you know, that's an example there. Ofcom do a lot as part of their BAU, but it may need to be enhanced as well. So you need a bit of budget for that. Also, these budget for these kind of enhancements and mobile networks improvements and so on often comes through discussions with the government, and it's usually DCMS that we're dealing with. But I would, you were talking about your intergovernment coordination, Mark. I would imagine that you work quite closely with DCMS. So, you know, having the right contacts there to go to straight away early in an event to plan for it. And then the same with likes of BT. If we are using, for example, we used Comms World for the UCI, they then used some BT circuits as an example, but we have an agreement with Comms World or the supplier for SLAs and resilience, but that can't necessarily be directly put onto the sub-supplier. So having someone within the sub-supplier who understands events, who you can go to, so that you can get a guaranteed level of service during the event, because the last thing you want is someone that's out of your control doing scheduled work on some of their switches during your event, or scheduled infrastructure work. So for me, there's a lot of help out there, but it's like having the right contacts and coordinating that group who understand the major events.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we're into our last few minutes, so I did want to take an opportunity to just take some questions from the audience. I can see that there's been a healthy debate ongoing as we've been chatting around. One point that's come up a couple of times is around non-terrestrial networks, high altitude platforms, satellites, etc. I mean, I think Kirsty, you might have mentioned that at one point, but do we see kind of non-terrestrial networks being part of the mix to help improve resilience? Are there any commercial issues? Are there any issues with some of these networks being outside of national control and things like that? So like last couple of minutes for that question. Is there anyone want to kind of come in on that?
I'll just quickly mention that we do see a lot of potential in satellite and non-terrestrial solutions supporting the resilience. So as I mentioned earlier, we've already used satellite for backhaul, but it's incredibly fast-paced industry, as we all know. And so we're looking at exploring ways of providing connectivity in the hard-to-reach locations, but as well as extending the reach of terrestrial connectivity, we see potentials in those solutions around providing fallback for in the event of disaster, disaster relief, humanitarian aid, and so on. We do have a commercial agreement with OneWeb, and so we're keen to work with providers like them, but it's definitely something we're going to be looking at more in the future from a BT perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And Mark, William, put you on the spot slightly from a kind of government and regulator perspective. Is that something that you're looking at?
It is, yeah, and I think although it's not a sort of currently a big part of the UK's mix, you know, we might expect that to grow a little in the coming years. So it's probably worth saying that sort of non-terrestrially, satellites play other important roles in not providing telecoms themselves, but providing facility for telecom, so position, navigation, and timing services through GPS, for example, have a small but important role to play for networks. And obviously, satellite solutions can provide a particularly helpful solution for very hard to reach areas and rural areas, in particular sort of use cases, maritime and so on. I think there is sort of potential for fixed access networks. I don't know if that sort of counts as non-terrestrial, but sort of masts that are positioned in high altitude areas on top of hills and on church spires and that sort of thing, as a potential kind of particularly niche solution for particular geographies. We're aware there are some mobile handsets that are now providing sort of at the higher end of the market, providing sort of direct connectivity with the emergency services. So that's something that we're supporting the 909 liaison committee to have a close look at, to make sure we understand what those technologies are and they're fully sort of interoperable with laws and standards and sort of BT's front end, who are the core handling agent for 999. But you know, potentially that could be quite a good sort of solution for people who for whatever reason are not able to get access through fixed or mobile means. So the sort of short answer is yes, it's quite a small picture of the piece of the pie at the moment, but maybe that might grow in coming years.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm conscious that we're right on time now, so I'll just wrap up by saying thank you to our panel. I've really enjoyed the session today. So thank you, William, Kirsty, Mark, and Martin, for your time and thoughts today. Thank you for everybody that listened to the webinar as well. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your day.